The Last Tide of Serral. Chapter 1. The night shift on relay station Aegis 9 had one rule nobody wrote down. Don't read the letters out loud. Ren Okafor broke that rule every single night, but only to herself, and only in the dark of the observation deck where the cameras logged movement, not sound. She had a message open in front of her now. It wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't addressed to anyone at the Concorde at all. It was a weather report, technically. A routine burst of atmospheric data bounced up from a listening buoy floating in the shallow sea below, the kind of thing the station's older instruments picked up by accident and forwarded without thinking. Except this buoy also picked up touch song. And touch song, if you knew how to listen for it, was not weather at all. Ren had spent 14 months learning to hear it properly. The Ilvain of Serral spoke first with their voices, which was soft and quick like water over stone, but they spoke truly with the touch organs along their forearms, pressed palm to palm or laid against packed clay tablets that carried the vibration for miles if the ground was right. Most linguists in the Concorde catalogued it as folk custom. Ren knew it was closer to a second language, richer than the spoken one, and almost nobody up here had bothered to learn it. Almost nobody except her, and the reason she'd learned it was sitting in front of her now, translated line by careful line. The high tide did not come this morning. The children asked where the fish went. I did not have an answer for them that would not frighten them further. I hope, whoever catches this signal by accident, that your winters are kinder than ours have become. It was signed, in the old way, with a place name instead of a person's name. Telling Shoal. Ren knew that shoal. She had a face to put to the signal now, an elder named Sarel who tended the tide charts there, though Sarel had no idea anyone above the sky was listening, let alone answering. Ren was not supposed to answer. She had answered anyway, twice, in careful bursts of code disguised as diagnostic pings that any auditor would assume was equipment chatter. It was, technically, against a dozen regulations. It was also the only real conversation she'd had in a year that didn't involve a status report. Ren had not always been the kind of person who broke rules quietly. Back on Earth, in the training years, she had been the officer who color-coded her compliance binders and corrected other cadet citation formats without being asked. Her instructors had called her promising. Her classmates had called her something less flattering, usually behind her back, though a few had said it to her face, which she'd respected more for the honesty. She still remembered the exact wording of the oath she'd taken the day she was accredited: to observe without interference, to document without judgment, to trust the process even when the process moves slowly. She had believed every word of it, once, the way young officers believe things that sound noble and have never yet cost them anything. 14 months on Aegis 9 had worn that belief down slowly, the way water wears down stone, one small patient erosion at a time. It had not been one dramatic betrayal. It had been 411 days of watching a planet suffer while a form sat unanswered in a queue, and somewhere in the middle of those days, without quite noticing the exact moment it happened, she had stopped being the cadet who corrected citation formats and become someone else instead. She minimized the file when she heard the door hiss open behind her. "You're doing the thing again," said Thomas Reyes, stepping onto the deck with 2 mugs of something that was trying very hard to be coffee. He was the station's chief engineer, and after 3 years of working 12 decks below her, he'd learned to read the back of her neck the way other people read faces. The thing where you look like you're about to either cry or file a formal complaint against the entire Concorde. "Can I do both?" Ren said. It wasn't really a question. Thomas handed her a mug and looked down through the observation deck's floor, which was really just very good glass and a very deep drop. Below them, half shrouded in cloud, the blue-green curve of Serral turned slowly on its axis. From this height it looked peaceful. It always did. That was the cruelty of altitude. "How bad today?" he said. "The tide didn't come in at Telling Shoal," Ren said. "That's the 3rd shoal this month. The moon's drift is outrunning every model we built for it. They built their whole coastline around a tide that isn't reliable anymore, and it's not going to become reliable again in their lifetimes. Maybe not in ours. And upstairs still hasn't ruled." "Upstairs," Ren said, with the particular venom she reserved for that word, "is still deliberating whether observing a pre-industrial culture during, quote, a period of significant internal transition constitutes premature contact under Section 12 of the First Threshold Accord." That's the same sentence they used 4 months ago. "It's the same sentence they've used for 411 days, Ren said. "I counted." Thomas didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked down at the planet, at the long silver thread of a river delta where, if you zoomed in far enough, You could make out the shapes of refugee camps that hadn't existed a year ago. I keep thinking there's some form we haven't filed yet, he said finally. Some report that would make them understand it's not theoretical down there. But I've filed every form there is. I've attached video. I've attached testimony. I've attached translated grief, Ren. And it just goes into the queue. Because to them it's not a planet, Ren said quietly. It's a compliance question. And compliance questions don't have to move fast, because nobody up here is the one going hungry. Below them, the tide did not come in, and somewhere on a shoal with no idea it was being heard, an old woman folded her hands and hoped a stranger might be kind. Ren minimized the second file too, the one she hadn't told Thomas about yet, and went back to staring at the water that wasn't there. Aegis 9 had been built for observation, not intervention, and every centimeter of it agreed with that decision loudly. The corridors were narrow enough that two people had to turn sideways to pass. The labs were small, cluttered with sensors calibrated for listening rather than reaching. There was no armory, no cargo bay stocked with relief supplies, nothing but glass and instruments and, somewhere in a locked archive 3 decks down, the complete written history of humanity's own worst mistakes, kept as a reference nobody upstairs had ever authorized anyone to share. Ren had read most of that archive twice. It was required study for anyone posted this far out, a way of teaching new officers what unchecked industrial ambition had cost Earth once, so they'd know the signs when they saw them starting somewhere else. It felt, some nights, like carrying a cure in a locked box and being told the patient wasn't cleared to receive it yet. She spent the morning after her conversation with Thomas doing what she always did, cataloguing. It was the job she'd been sent here to do, and she still did it properly, because pretending otherwise wouldn't have helped anyone. Touch song transcripts. Trade route maps assembled from a year of quiet surveillance. A slow, patient dictionary of a language nobody at the Concord had asked her to build. At midday, Chief Archivist Priyanka Voss called a briefing, which on a station this size meant 6 people crowded into a room meant for 4, watching a screen that showed the same graphs it had shown for 3 months running. Crop failure has now reached the 3rd continent, Voss said, in the flat, careful voice she used for briefings, the voice of someone who had learned to say terrible numbers without letting them show on her face. Tidal agriculture across both hemispheres is failing at a rate consistent with our worst-case orbital model, not our median one. Disease is spreading through the refugee corridors along here, and here. She traced 2 lines on the map with a stylus. Local governance in the Eastern Basin has effectively dissolved. What remains is being run by regional militias distributing what food exists. And the appeal, Thomas said, from the back of the room, though everyone already knew the answer. Appeal 7C remains under review by the Threshold Committee, Voss said. No new ruling. They've requested an additional ecological impact assessment, which I have already submitted 11 times in various formats. They know, Ren said, before she could stop herself. They've known for over a year. This isn't caution anymore. This is just filing. Voss looked at her for a long moment, not unkindly. She was not an unkind woman, only a tired one who had learned, over a long career, exactly how far her own frustration was allowed to travel before it stopped being useful. I share your feeling, Dr. Okafor, she said. I do not share the authority to act on it. Nobody in this room does. That authority sits 6,000 light-years away with people who have never seen this planet except as a line item. The meeting ended the way it always ended, with a list of tasks that changed nothing and a closing line that Voss delivered like a small, tired ritual. We continue to observe. We continue to document. We wait for direction. Ren walked out with that sentence sitting in her chest like a stone. She found Thomas afterward in the narrow galley that served as the station's only real gathering space, sitting with a tray of the same reconstituted protein loaf that had been on rotation for a month, looking at it with the particular betrayed expression of a man who had once, long ago, eaten real food and never quite recovered from the memory. You're staring at your lunch like it insulted your family, Ren said, sliding in across from him. It did, Thomas said. 3 years ago. I still haven't forgiven it. He nudged the tray toward her. Want half? It's slightly less offensive when shared. Generous. I try. He watched her for a moment, the way he always did after briefing, gauging how much of the meeting she was still carrying. Teach me something, he said finally. About them. Not the collapse. Something else. I need 5 minutes where I'm not thinking about tide charts. Ren considered this, then allowed herself a small smile, the first one that day. Did you know that touch language started as a phishing signal? Before it was anything else. Before philosophy, before law, before any of the formal registers I've spent a year cataloguing. Fishing crews out on the flats needed a way to talk to each other underwater, or through fog, without shouting and scaring off the catch. Palm against palm, forearm against forearm. Somebody's great-great-grandmother, 1,000 generations back, figured out you could say nets caught on the reef with your hands faster than you could shout it across open water. That's oddly practical for a whole secondary language. Most beautiful things start practical, Wren said. It's why the formal register still uses fishing metaphors for things that have nothing to do with fishing. There's a phrase Sarel used once, in an early message, that translates roughly to the tide does not owe the shore an explanation. It's what you say to someone who's grieving something nobody could have prevented. It comes from a fishing curse, originally, something you'd mutter when a storm ruined a catch you'd work hard for. Somewhere along the way, it turned into the kindest thing you can say to someone in mourning. Thomas was quiet for a moment, turning that over. That's the first thing you've told me all week that didn't make me want to put my fist through a bulkhead. I keep a list, Wren admitted, of things like that. Not for any report. Just somewhere to put the parts of this job that aren't collapse and paperwork. She paused. I don't know why I'm telling you that. Because it's the truest thing you've said all day, Thomas said, and you've been carrying the rest of it alone for longer than you should. Wren didn't answer that directly. She ate half of his unfortunate lunch instead, and for 5 minutes, neither of them mentioned the tide charts at all. That night, back on the observation deck, she opened Sarel's second message, the one she hadn't shown Thomas. The militia came through the shoal yesterday and took what stores remained, for the capital, they said, though I do not think the capital will see much of it. My granddaughter asked me if the old stories were true, that once there were people in the sky who watched over us and kept us from harm. I told her I did not believe in such people. I hope, whoever you are, that I was wrong to say so. I do not expect an answer. I only wished someone, somewhere, to know that we tried very hard to save ourselves, in case it did not work. Wren sat with that message for a long time before she typed anything back. Then, very quietly, she opened a file she had been building for 6 months without telling anyone. A survey of Seral's own engineering traditions, its water wheel foundries, its tidal clocks, the surprisingly sophisticated hydraulic knowledge the Ilvain had developed on their own, centuries before any of this began. Not a gift of alien technology. Something smaller and, she suspected, far more dangerous to admit out loud. The beginnings of a plan that didn't require the Concorde's permission at all, only its silence. She closed the file before she let herself finish the thought, and told herself, the way she had every night for 6 months, that tomorrow she would delete it. She did not delete it. Instead, over the following weeks, the file grew. Wren told herself each addition was harmless, a translated proverb here, a diagram of an old Ilvain canal system there, the kind of thing any cataloger might collect. But she knew, in the part of her mind she kept locked separately from the part that wrote status reports, exactly what shape the file was taking. It was becoming a plan for how 6-limbed engineers with steam foundries and no orbital survey data might, with the right nudge in the right place, build their own answer to a moon that would not behave. The nudge was the part she hadn't solved yet. It was Thomas who found her with it, 3 weeks later, hunched over a schematic of a counterweight lock system at 2 a.m, station time, with 3 days of unwashed hair and an expression he recognized because he'd worn it himself the week his sister died. You've been down here every night this week, he said, not as an accusation, just as an observation, the way he might note that a valve was overdue for inspection. I've been thinking, Wren said. About. She didn't answer right away, so he pulled a stool over and sat, uninvited, the way he'd learned he could get away with after 3 years of working the same isolated posting. You mentioned my sister once, Wren said instead, after a while. You never finished the story. Thomas exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that meant he was deciding whether the hour was late enough to justify honesty. She was a relief coordinator. Groundside, back on Earth, during the last of the resettlement years after the Ashgrove floods. There was a supply convoy that could have reached a camp 3 days before it did. It didn't, because the routing authorization sat in front of a regional committee for those same 3 days, waiting on a signature nobody wanted to be the one to give in case it went wrong. She spent those 3 days arguing with people who kept telling her the process existed for good reasons. She wasn't wrong that it did. She also watched 11 people die of something a convoy sitting 40 kilometers away could have prevented, and she never really forgave the version of herself that followed the process instead of just driving the truck herself. "Is that why you're an engineer instead of an administrator?" Wren asked quietly. "I fix things that can be fixed with my hands," Thomas said, "because the things that need fixing with authority and permission have a way of not getting fixed at all, in my experience. I came out here thinking distance would make that easier to live with. Turns out watching the exact same shape of failure happen to an entire planet is not, in fact, easier from 300 kilometers up." He looked at her for a long moment. "So when I ask if you're really doing this, I'm not asking as your supervisor's favorite worrier. I'm asking as someone who already knows exactly what it costs to wait for the signature." "About?" She turned the screen toward him. He looked at it for a long moment, at the neat rows of Ilvain engineering diagrams beside a stack of orbital drift models, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 30 years fixing things that weren't supposed to be fixable, exactly what he was looking at. "You're not thinking about translation anymore," he said.
No.
"Wren. I know. This isn't a report you can file," Thomas said. "This is the kind of thing that gets people recalled. Or worse." "I know that too," Wren said, and there was something in her voice that surprised him, a kind of tired, settled calm rather than the frustration he'd expected. "Thomas, I've spent a year listening to an old woman on a shoal explain, very politely, that she and her granddaughter are probably going to die of something we could prevent with information we already have sitting in a locked archive 3 decks below us. Not weapons. Not warp engines. Information. Things they could build themselves, if someone just told them which of their own ideas were the right ones to try first. And you think you can just hand that over?" "No," Wren said. "I think I have to find a way to leave it somewhere they'd find it on their own. Somewhere it looks like an accident. Somewhere nobody up here has to sign their name to it except me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Outside the small observation window, Cyril turned, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the argument happening in its shadow. "You'd be risking your whole career," he said. "Maybe more than that." "I know," Wren said again. "I've thought about that part a great deal." "And you're going to do it anyway." Wren looked at the diagram on her screen, a lock system Ilvain engineers had half invented already, 3 generations back, and abandoned for lack of the one insight that would have made it viable, and thought of an old woman on a shoal telling her granddaughter that stories about people in the sky were not true. "I think," Wren said slowly, "I might already have started." There was a name for what Wren was circling, though she hadn't said it out loud yet, not even to Thomas. She'd found it 3 months earlier, buried in an annex of the first Threshold Accord that almost nobody read past the first page, because almost nobody needed to. The annex was old. Older than the Concord itself, in fact, a clause carried over from Earth's earliest interstellar charters, back when humanity had still been arguing with itself about what kind of civilization it wanted to become before it went looking for others to meet. It was called, in the dry legal language of the original document, the Individual Conscience Provision. Everyone who'd ever heard of it at all called it something simpler. The Open Hand Clause. It said, in essence, that any accredited officer of the Concord retained the personal, non-transferable right to act unilaterally to prevent imminent, irreversible harm to a sentient population, provided they surrendered themselves for full review afterward and could demonstrate the action was taken to prevent harm rather than to seize advantage. It had been written, Wren learned from the footnotes, after a single catastrophic year in Earth's own history when entire agencies had stood by, citing protocol, while people died who might have been saved by one official simply refusing to wait for permission. The people who wrote the Concord's founding charter had wanted to make certain that never happened again, not even light years from home. In 300 years, it had been invoked 4 times. 2 of the officers who invoked it had been vindicated. 2 had lost everything. Wren read those 4 cases more times than she could count, in the weeks after she found the clause, looking for the difference between the officers who survived their own conscience and the ones who didn't. The first vindicated case was over a century old, a quarantine officer on an outer survey post who had broken containment protocol to move medicine across a border during an outbreak, against direct orders, because the orders had been drafted by someone 6 months communication delay away who did not know the outbreak had already crossed the river the protocol assumed would contain it. She had been fully transparent about every step she took, had endangered no one who hadn't already been dying regardless, and had made certain the record showed exactly what she knew and when she knew it. The review board had taken 4 months to clear her, and the clause itself had been quietly amended afterward to close a loophole she'd been forced to argue around. The failure that troubled Wren more was the one that looked, on its surface, almost identical. An officer on a resource survey world had diverted an emergency water reclamation system toward a drought-stricken settlement without disclosing that the diversion would also, incidentally, benefit a mining operation his own brother held shares in. He had told himself, and apparently believed, that the humanitarian outcome justified the omission. The board had not disagreed that lives were saved. They had disagreed, unanimously and without much debate, that a man who hid even one relevant fact from the people judging him had never truly invoked the open hand clause at all. He had used its language to dress up something closer to opportunism, and the distinction, once the board drew it, seemed to rend the entire heart of the matter. It came down, as far as she could tell, to one thing: whether what they'd done could survive being fully understood, in the open, by the people who judged them. Not whether it was popular. Not even, strictly, whether it worked. Only whether every part of it could be said aloud, in a room, to people with the power to end a career, without needing to leave anything out. She thought about that a great deal, sitting alone on the observation deck with Sarel's last 3 messages open in front of her. The Eastern Basin has gone quiet, which is worse than the shouting was. My granddaughter no longer asks about the people in the sky. I think she has stopped believing children are permitted to hope for such things. I am sorry to trouble whatever listens to this signal with such small sadness, when I imagine you must hear far greater sadness from elsewhere. I only wish to speak to someone before the tide charts became meaningless entirely. Wren typed a response she did not send, deleted it, and typed another. On the 40th night, she stopped deleting. Telling Shoal, she wrote, in the careful, patient touch cipher she had spent a year learning to render in text, "Your tide charts are not meaningless. The moon that misbehaves has misbehaved before, on worlds far from yours, and there are ways to build against it that your own engineers came very close to discovering 3 generations ago. I cannot tell you who I am. I can tell you where to look. Send someone you trust to the old lock foundry at the mouth of your river, 3 nights from now, after the low tide that will not rise. Tell no one why. I am sorry I cannot do more than this. I hope it is enough." She read it 11 times. Then she encoded it inside a weather diagnostic burst, the same channel she'd always used, and sent it down through the buoy at Telling Shoal before she could talk herself out of it. It was not a gift of technology. It was barely more than a rumor, a pointed finger, an old woman's granddaughter getting one more reason to hope. But it was the first thing Wren had done in 14 months that felt like more than watching. She sat with the sent message confirmation glowing on her screen for a long time, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not yet, but the strange, weightless calm of having finally stepped off a ledge she'd been standing on for months. 3 decks below her, unnoticed, a routine data packet from Wren's terminal logged itself, as all packets did, in the station's automatic archive, the kind of packet a tired auditor might skim past without a second look on any ordinary week. This was not going to be an ordinary week. The message reached Telling Shoal on the evening of the 3rd day, carried by a young courier named Doran who had been Sarel's student for 11 years and had learned, in that time, never to ask the old woman why she wanted things done a certain way. Doran had grown up believing the Tidehouse receiver was mostly ceremonial, a relic his teacher kept out of sentiment rather than any real expectation of use, the way some households kept a grandparent's fishing net long after the family had stopped fishing. He had sat with Sarel on many quiet evenings while she listened to its static, and he had learned to read her face in those moments the way he'd learned to read weather, the small furrow between her eyes that meant hope she wouldn't admit to, and the particular stillness of her hands that meant she was bracing herself against disappointment before it arrived. That evening, when the burst came through clearer than any signal he'd heard the old receiver produce in 11 years, he watched both expressions cross her face within the space of a single breath, and understood, before she said a word, that something had finally changed. Sarel read the encoded burst twice on the small crystal receiver her family had kept in the Tidehouse for 3 generations, more out of habit than expectation. She had built no illusions about what came through that receiver most nights. Static, weather, the occasional garbled fragment of something that might have been music from very far away. She had not expected an answer to the small, private grief she'd been sending into the sky for over a year. She read the message a 3rd time before she believed it was real. There are ways to build against it that your own engineers came very close to discovering 3 generations ago. She knew exactly what that meant. Her own grandfather had worked the old lock foundry at the river's mouth before it was abandoned, back when the counterweight gates had failed their first trial and the guild that funded them had judged the whole design a foolish waste of good iron. She still had his notebooks, water-stained and half illegible, sitting in a chest she had never quite been able to throw away. She went to the foundry herself, on the third night, rather than send Doran alone. What she found there was not a machine, not a gift, not anything so simple as that. It was a single sheet of thin, resilient material she did not recognize, tucked into the housing of the old counterweight mechanism where any storm would have missed it and any curious child would eventually have found it. On it, in careful, deliberate Ilvain script, someone had drawn a modification to the original lock design. One additional gate, positioned at an angle her grandfather's design had never considered, solving the exact flaw that had doomed the whole project 3 generations earlier. There was no signature. There was a single line at the bottom, in the old formal style reserved for anonymous well-wishers at funerals and namings alike. Your own hands built most of this already. I only moved one piece. Sarel sat on the cold stone floor of the abandoned foundry for a long time, holding her grandfather's water-stained notebook in one hand and the stranger's diagram in the other, and found that she was crying in a way she had not allowed herself to do since the food riots began. She did not tell the militia. She did not tell the regional council, which had, in any case, stopped answering messages from Shoaltowns weeks ago. She told the 7 engineers she trusted most in the world, all of whom had spent their careers being told their trade was a dying one, and she told them exactly what her grandfather had told her, that the lock had always been sound, that it had only ever needed one more idea nobody at the time had thought to try. Not all 7 engineers believed her at first. A broad-shouldered woman named Ferid, who had inherited her forge from a mother who had inherited it from a grandmother who had never once trusted anything that arrived without a name attached, folded her arms over the diagram and refused to touch it for the better part of an hour. Anonymous kindness is not a category the world has given us much reason to believe in, Elder, Ferid said. Charity with no name behind it usually has a price attached that only becomes visible later. I have thought that too, Sarel admitted. I thought it for a long time, in fact, before I let myself hope otherwise. But look at what is actually written here, Ferid. Not a demand. Not a request for anything in return. A single correction to a design your own grandmother helped build with her hands, generations ago, before the guild called it foolish and walked away. Whoever left this did not give us a gift we could not have made ourselves. They only gave us back a piece of our own work we had lost. Ferid studied the diagram a while longer, tracing the unfamiliar angle of the new gate with one careful finger, testing the mathematics of it silently against everything she knew of load and pressure and the particular stubbornness of tidal water. The angle is sound, she admitted finally, grudging and precise, the way engineers admit things they wish they'd thought of first. It redistributes the strain exactly where the original design failed. Whoever drew this understood counterweight mechanics better than the guildmasters who rejected my grandmother's design in the first place. Then will you help rebuild it? I will help rebuild it, Ferid said, because the mathematics are sound, Elder, not because I have decided to believe in kindness from the sky. I reserve the right to remain suspicious of that part a while longer. Sarel accepted this with the patient half-smile of someone who had negotiated far harder bargains than this one. That is a fair enough position to start from, she said. Suspicion has kept this shoal alive longer than trust ever did. I only ask that you let the lock hold water before you decide whether to keep it. They began rebuilding within the week. Word spread, the way it always spreads in a place small enough that everyone still remembers everyone's grandparents, and by the second week 3 more shoals had sent engineers to see the design for themselves, and by the third week the militia that controlled the region's iron stores found itself with an unexpected and inconvenient number of requests for foundry materials that had nothing to do with weapons. None of it moved fast. None of it moved the way a story might want it to move, in one dramatic surge that fixed everything at once. It moved the way real recovery moves, slowly, stubbornly, 3 shoals at a time, built by hands that had never stopped knowing how to build, only lacked the one idea that let them start again. Ren, watching from 300 kilometers up, saw none of the tears in the foundry and none of the arguments among the engineers about whether the design could really be trusted. She saw only data, tidal engineering activity increasing at Telling Shoal, then at 2 neighboring settlements, then at 4. A small, stubborn ember of activity in a region the collapse models had already written off as lost. She told herself it might be a coincidence. She knew, watching the numbers climb steadily night after night, that it was not. She did not know yet that a station-wide compliance audit, scheduled routinely and without any suspicion attached to it, was 6 days away from reaching her terminal's data logs. The audit arrived on schedule, the way audits always did, entirely uninterested in the fact that its timing was about to matter enormously. It was Voss who found the anomaly, 3 days into her review, sitting alone in the archive office with a screen full of outbound data packets she was required to reconcile against the station's authorized communication log. Most of it was exactly what it should have been: sensor telemetry, diagnostic pings, the dull administrative exhaust of a station doing its job. One packet, sent 43 days earlier from Ren Okafor's terminal, did not match anything on the authorized list. Voss ran it twice before she opened it, hoping, in the quiet way tired people hope for things they already suspect are false, that it would turn out to be a filing error. It was not a filing error. Buried inside a weather diagnostic burst was a fully rendered message in Ilvain touch cipher, addressed to a specific shoal, containing specific engineering guidance that no observation-only officer had any authority to send. Voss sat with it for a long moment before she called Ren into her office, and when she did, her voice carried none of the flat, careful calm of the weekly briefings. It carried something closer to exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion, something that might almost have been grief. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like," Voss said, without preamble, turning the screen toward her. Ren looked at it. She had known, somewhere in the calm, weightless part of her mind that had made the decision 43 days ago, that this moment would come eventually. Knowing it did not make it easier to sit through. "It's what it looks like," Ren said. "Do you understand what you've done?" "I understand exactly what I've done," Ren said. "I've spent a year listening to a civilization die by inches, while the people with the authority to help them argued about paperwork. I found a way to give them one idea. Not a ship. Not a weapon. Not even a machine. One idea their own engineers had already built 90% of the way to, generations ago. I sent it to a single shoal, anonymously, with no identifying information, in a way that could not be traced back to the Concorde even if it were discovered." "Except it was discovered," Voss said. "By me. Which means it will be discovered by the Threshold Committee within the week. And Ren, I need you to understand, they are not going to see one idea. They are going to see an officer who unilaterally violated the first threshold accord during an active contact review, and they are going to make an example of you, because that is exactly the kind of story that terrifies committees like that." "I know." "Do you?" Voss said, and for the first time in the 3 years Ren had known her, her voice cracked, just slightly, around the edges. "Because I have spent this entire year filing every report I could think to file, watching every appeal go nowhere, feeling every bit as helpless as you do, and I never did what you just did, because I was afraid of exactly this conversation. And now I have to have it anyway. So no, Ren, I don't think you fully understand what you've done, because if you did, you would look more frightened than you currently do." Ren was quiet for a moment. Below them, through the small window of Voss's office, Cyril turned, and somewhere on it 3 more shoals had begun rebuilding locks that had sat abandoned for 3 generations. "I am frightened," Ren said finally, quietly. "I've been frightened for 6 months. I did it anyway, because I decided being frightened wasn't a good enough reason to keep doing nothing." "Why didn't you come to me?" Voss asked, and this time the question landed differently, less like an accusation and more like something that had been sitting under all her other questions the entire time. "You could have. I would have told you it was reckless. I would very likely have told you not to do it. But you didn't even give me the chance to say no, Ren. You made this decision entirely alone, and I find that the part of this conversation I am struggling with most." Ren considered the question carefully before she answered it, because she owed Voss more than a quick reply. "Because if I'd told you, and you'd said no, I would have had to either disobey you directly, which would have ended your career alongside mine for nothing, or I would have had to let Sarel keep sending messages into a sky that never answered. And if I'd told you and you'd said yes, you would have been just as exposed as I am now, without ever having made the choice to expose yourself. I didn't think either version was fair to you. I wanted the risk to belong only to the person who chose to take it. That is either the most considerate thing anyone on this station has done for me in 3 years, Voss said, or the most patronizing. I confess I have not fully decided which." "I'd understand if it's the second," Ren said. "I've turned it over in my own head more than once and I'm still not entirely sure myself." Voss looked at her for a long time. Then she closed the file, and folded her hands on the desk, and said, in a voice that had gone very tired and very careful again, "The Threshold Committee convenes review boards from an office 6,000 light-years away, Ren. This will not be a quiet conversation. I am required to report what I found. I am also required to tell you that you have the right to prepare a defense before that report reaches them." "I know," Ren said again. Then prepare one, Voss said. Because whatever happens next, I would rather you walk into that hearing having thought it all the way through, than simply having felt it deeply and hoped that would be enough. Ren spent the 6 days before the hearing the way she had spent the 6 months before her decision, reading. Not the treaty this time, not the 4 historical cases she already knew by heart, but the transmissions from Telling Shoal, all of them, from the very first weather report accident 14 months earlier to the newest one, sent only that morning. The lock at Telling Shoal held through the highest storm tide we have recorded in memory. Sarel had written, in a message that had not been meant for anyone at the Concorde, only for the small private archive Ren had never officially been authorized to keep. 3 neighboring shoals have sent engineers to study the design. My granddaughter asked me again about the people in the sky. This time I told her I did not know if they existed, but that someone had once left something kind where we could find it, and that kindness, wherever it comes from, is a thing worth believing in even without proof of its source. She seemed satisfied with that answer in a way she was not satisfied with my previous one. Ren read that message more times than any other, in the 6 days before the hearing, and found that it settled something in her that 6 months of careful legal research had not quite managed to settle. Whatever the Threshold Committee decided about her, the lock at Telling Shoal had held. A grandmother had found a better answer to give her grandchild. That part, at least, could not be taken back by any ruling, however severe. Thomas found her the night before the hearing, back on the observation deck where all of this had started, staring down at the slow-turning curve of a planet that had no idea it had become, quite unintentionally, the reason a human officer 600 kilometers above it might lose everything she'd built her life around. You could still say it was a mistake, Thomas said, sitting down beside her. A misconfigured relay. Equipment error. I could back that story. Half the engineering log would back that story. I thought about that, Ren admitted. For about 4 minutes, 3 nights ago. And then I thought about what happens if I lie to save myself and it works, Ren said. I'd keep my post. I'd probably even keep listening to Sarel's messages, quietly, the way I always have. But I'd have proven, to myself if no one else, that the only way to do the right thing in the system is to also be willing to lie about having done it. I don't think I can live inside that particular contradiction for the next 400 years, Thomas. I'd rather tell the truth and lose the post than keep it by pretending I didn't mean what I did. Thomas was quiet for a while. Then he said, in the careful voice of a man choosing his next words with unusual precision, "You know there's a version of tomorrow where they don't just recall you. There's a version where this becomes the reason the Threshold Committee finally rules on Appeal 7C, not in your favor, in the other direction. Full lockdown. No further contact of any kind, no exceptions, ever, specifically because of what you did." I know, Ren said. I've thought about that possibility more than any other, honestly. It's the one that actually frightens me. And you're still going in there tomorrow and telling them everything. I'm going in there tomorrow, Ren said, and telling them the truth, and trusting that a system built by people who wrote the open hand clause in the first place still has room in it for someone to have done what I did for the reasons I did it. If it doesn't, if the honest answer really is that no officer is ever allowed to choose conscience over protocol, not even once, not even to save an old woman's granddaughter from growing up believing kindness doesn't exist, then I think that's a truth worth knowing plainly, rather than hiding from behind a story about a broken relay. Below them, unaware of any of it, the tide came in at Telling Shoal, on schedule, for the first time in 14 months. Voss found her afterward. Once Thomas had gone to check on the shuttle systems one more time out of nervous habit rather than necessity. She did not sit down. She stood at the observation window with her arms folded, looking down at the same slow curve of planet Ren had been watching for an hour. I filed my statement this afternoon, Voss said, in support of your invocation. I wanted you to hear it from me before you hear it read aloud tomorrow, in case it changes anything about how you walk in there. You didn't have to do that, Ren said. It could cost you as much as it costs me. I am aware of exactly what it could cost me, Voss said, with the dry, tired precision she brought to everything. I have run the numbers on my own career the same way I ran the numbers on the crop failures, and I find I no longer care for the answer either way. I have spent this entire year telling myself that filing the correct form, however many times it took, was itself a kind of action. I have watched you prove me wrong about that, Ren, and I find I would rather stand next to the proof than pretend I never saw it. I don't know if it's going to work, Ren admitted. The committee, I mean. I don't know if the outcome on Cyril is even going to be enough to matter, legally. Thomas thinks it might make things worse. A full lockdown, if they decide my actions prove the system can't be trusted with any exceptions at all. That is a real possibility, Voss said, without softening it, because softening things had never been her way of comforting anyone. I have also considered it. I find I would still rather stand here having told the truth about what I found, and what I believe about why you did it, than have filed one more quiet report and let the silence make the decision for me instead. She was quiet a moment, watching the planet turn. For what it's worth, Dr. Okafor, I have read your file more carefully this past week than I have read anything in years. I do not think you did this carelessly. I think you did it the way careful people do reckless things, only after every other door had been checked, and found locked, and checked again to be certain. The hearing convened the next morning in the largest room Aegis 9 had, which still was not very large, with the Threshold Committee attending by real-time relay from 6,000 light-years away, their faces slightly delayed on the main screen in a way that made every pause in the conversation feel a half-second longer than it should. The presiding officer, a severe-looking man named Councillor Amada Fenn, opened without ceremony. Dr. Okafor, you are aware of the specific charges. I am, Wren said. You transmitted unauthorized technical guidance to a pre-industrial contact population during an active review period, in direct violation of Section 12 of the First Threshold Accord. Do you dispute the facts as presented in Archivist Voss's report? I do not, Wren said. Every detail in that report is accurate. A murmur moved through the small gathered audience. Voss, Thomas, 3 other station officers who had come to watch, none of whom had expected quite such a plain admission so early. Then before this committee determines consequence, Fenn said, you will explain, for the record, why you believed your judgment superior to the collective judgment of the review process this accord establishes. Wren had rehearsed this moment for 6 days. She found, standing in it, that she did not need the rehearsed version after all. I don't believe my judgment was superior to the committee's, she said. I believe the committee's judgment was never given the chance to matter in time, because the review process this accord establishes has no mechanism for urgency, and the crisis on Cyril did not wait politely for one to be invented. I did not send weapons. I did not send a ship, or a reactor, or anything that could not have been discovered independently by the people who received it, in time, on their own. I sent one idea to one community, anonymously, built entirely from their own abandoned engineering work. I did it because I had spent 14 months listening to an old woman on a shoal tell a receiver she didn't believe was listening that she hoped, without much conviction left, that someone kind still existed somewhere. I decided that if such a person existed, it might as well be me, since I appeared to be the only one in a position to act. That is a compelling personal account, Fenn said, not unkindly. But this committee governs by law, Dr. Okafor, not by sentiment. You have confessed to a clear violation. I have, Wren said. I would also like to formally invoke Section 4, Annex 2, of the founding charter of this Concord, the individual conscience provision. The murmur in the room sharpened into something closer to silence. On the delayed screen, several of the councillors exchanged a look that suggested at least 2 of them had needed a moment to recall the clause existed at all. You are invoking the open hand clause, Fenn said slowly. I am, Wren said. The provision exists specifically for circumstances in which institutional process, however well-intentioned, fails to prevent imminent and irreversible harm to a sentient population, and an accredited officer is left to choose between waiting for a system to move and acting to prevent harm it cannot yet prevent in time. I acted to prevent exactly that harm. I surrendered myself for full review, as the clause requires. I withheld nothing, disguised nothing, and I am prepared to answer for every part of what I did, in the open, in front of this committee and in front of the historical record, without exception. Fenn was quiet for a long moment, the delay on the screen stretching the silence out further than it already was. That clause has been invoked 4 times in 300 years, he said finally. It has succeeded twice. I'm aware of the history, Wren said. I read it very carefully before I acted, Councillor. Both officers who succeeded were the ones whose actions could withstand being fully understood by the people who judged them. I have tried, very deliberately, to make certain mine could too. A second councillor, a woman whose delayed image kept half a second behind her own words in a way that made her seem perpetually on the verge of catching up to herself, leaned forward. Dr. Okafor, you state you sought no advantage for yourself. Yet your professional file shows 14 months of documented, escalating frustration with this committee's handling of Appeal 7C. Is it not possible that what you experienced as moral clarity was, in fact, simply anger, dressed in more flattering language? Wren considered the question seriously before she answered it, because it deserved to be considered seriously. I've asked myself the same thing more than once, Counselor, in the 6 months it took me to act. I don't think the two are as separate as your question assumes. I was angry. I am still angry. But anger told me something was wrong. It did not tell me what to do about it. What I chose to do, one idea, sent anonymously, built from a civilization's own abandoned work, disclosed fully the moment it was discovered, was not decided in anger. It was decided very slowly, over 6 months, specifically because I did not trust the anger alone to choose well. And if this committee finds that distinction insufficient, Fenn said, and rules that no personal conviction, however carefully reasoned, may override Section 12 during an active review, what then, Dr. Okafor? Will you accept that ruling? I will accept whatever this committee decides, Wren said. I surrendered myself for exactly that reason. But I would ask the committee to consider, before it rules, what message a conviction against me sends to every officer stationed somewhere isolated enough that help is 6,000 light years and 14 months away. I would ask what this committee believes an officer should do, concretely, the next time a queue moves slower than the crisis it was meant to answer. If the answer is simply wait longer, I think this committee owes it to every future Archivist Voss and every future Wren Okafor to say so plainly, rather than leaving the clause on the books as a comfort nobody is actually permitted to use. Nobody on the delayed screen answered that immediately. Fenn finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been through the rest of the proceeding. This committee will recess to deliberate. Dr. Okafor, you understand that a ruling of this kind cannot be rushed, whatever your feelings about queues and timelines. I understand the irony, Counselor, Wren said, better than most people in this room. The committee did not rule that day. Committees of that kind rarely did. Wren was placed on administrative suspension pending formal review, confined to quarters aboard Aegis 9 with her outbound communications monitored, and told, in the flat procedural language of institutions everywhere, that a final determination would be reached in due course. She did not have access to the Ilvain relay feeds during those weeks. She did not know, sitting in the narrow quiet of her quarters, whether the locks at Telling Shoal had held through the next storm season, or whether the militia had eventually found and seized the rebuilt foundries, or whether Sarel's granddaughter still believed, even a little, in the idea that kindness might come from somewhere unexpected. Thomas visited when he was permitted to, which was not often, and brought with him the small scraps of station gossip that passed for news in a place this isolated. Voss put in a statement, he told her, on one of those visits. Officially, on the record, in support of your invocation. She didn't have to do that. It could reflect on her just as badly as it reflects on you. I didn't ask her to, Wren said. I know. She said that's exactly why she did it. There was a stretch of days, somewhere around the 3rd week, when Wren stopped believing any of it would matter. She had read the 4 historical cases so many times she could recite them, and she found herself dwelling less on the 2 officers who had been vindicated and more on the 2 who had not, one of whom, according to the archive, had been quietly discharged and had never worked in any capacity for the Concord again, her name reduced in the official record to a footnote about procedural overreach. Wren lay awake in the narrow dark of her confined quarters and tried to imagine that footnote with her own name in it, and found the imagining came far too easily. I keep thinking about what happens if I'm the 3rd one, she told Thomas, on one of his ration visits, her voice flatter than he'd heard it since the whole thing began. Not the 2 who succeeded. The 2 who didn't. I keep thinking I did all of this so certain I was right, and certainty isn't actually evidence of anything, Thomas. It's just what it feels like right before you find out you were wrong. You weren't wrong, Thomas said. You don't know that. Neither do I. Not really. I know the lock held for 1 storm season. I don't know if it holds for 10. I don't know if ferried suspicion turns out to be the wiser instinct after all, and in 20 years some historian writes a very calm paragraph about how a single overreaching linguist destabilized a fragile recovery she didn't understand as well as she thought she did. Thomas was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was choosing not to offer comfort that wasn't earned. I can't tell you it'll turn out fine, he said finally. I don't know that either. What I can tell you is that you did the thing my sister never let herself do, and whatever the committee decides, that part doesn't get undone by their ruling. You didn't wait for the signature. Whatever else is true, that part's already finished, and it was the right shape of true when you did it. Wren didn't answer that. But she slept, that night, for the first time in 9 days, longer than 4 hours at a stretch. On the 41st day of the review, Wren was summoned back to the same room, to the same delayed faces on the same screen, and this time Councillor Fenn did not open with the charges. He opened with a single question. Dr. Okafor, are you aware of the current status of Telling Shoal? Wren's chest tightened. I have not had access to the relay feeds during my suspension, Councillor. Fenn nodded and gestured, and the screen shifted to show a set of survey images Wren had not taken and had not authorized, gathered instead by an official Concorde observation drone dispatched, apparently, in the week since her hearing began. She saw the lock at Telling Shoal, rebuilt and holding steady against a tide that would once have overwhelmed it. She saw, in the towns beyond it, the beginnings of planted fields and soil that had gone unplanted for over a year. She saw, in one still frame that made her breath catch, a small figure she recognized from long-range imaging as Sarel, standing at the shoal's edge with a child beside her, both of them watching the water come in. The committee has reviewed the material outcome of your action independently of your testimony, Fenn said. We have also reviewed, at some length, the history and intent of the individual conscience provision you invoked. It was written, as you correctly noted, to prevent exactly the kind of institutional paralysis that characterized this Concorde's handling of Appeal 7C over the past year. That failure is not, in this committee's assessment, entirely yours to answer for. He paused, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, something in his expression shifted towards something that was not quite warmth, but was no longer entirely severity either. This committee finds that your invocation of the open hand clause was made in good faith, disclosed fully, and directed solely at preventing demonstrable, irreversible harm, with no material advantage sought for yourself or for the Concorde. Your actions are found consistent with the provision's original intent. No further disciplinary action will be taken. The room was very quiet. However, Fenn continued, and Wren felt the quiet turn brittle again. This committee also finds that the underlying failure you identified, 14 months of inaction on a straightforward humanitarian appeal, represents a far more serious institutional problem than any individual officer's response to it. Appeal 7C is hereby granted, effective immediately, with full authorization for measured contact and assistance protocols to begin. Dr. Okafor, given your demonstrated expertise, this committee is prepared to offer you formal leadership of that contact program, should you wish to accept it. Wren did not answer immediately. She had rehearsed 6 days of arguments for the possibility of losing everything, and had spent almost no time at all preparing for the possibility of this. It took her a long moment to trust her own voice enough to use it. I accept, Councillor, she said finally. On one condition, if the committee will permit it. Fenn raised an eyebrow, the delay on the screen making the gesture arrive a half-second late, like an afterthought catching up to itself. You are in a curious position to be attaching conditions, Dr. Okafor, given the morning you have had. I understand that, Wren said, and I ask it anyway. I want the open hand clause reviewed and clarified, formally, so the next officer who finds themselves in my position doesn't have to guess whether conscience is actually permitted to matter, or spend 6 months building a case in secret the way I did, afraid of exactly this room. Archivist Voss spent a year filing every form available to her and it changed nothing. I don't want the lesson future officers take from today to be that the only way to help is to risk everything alone in the dark. I would like it to be part of the record, plainly, so it doesn't have to be rediscovered by someone else the hard way. Fenn was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, something in his tone had shifted again, settling into something that might, eventually, with time, become respect. That request will be entered for review, he said. I will note, for the record, that it is a more measured request than this committee generally receives from an officer in your position on the same day as a vindication. I've had 6 months to think about very little else, Councillor, Wren said. It seemed a shame to waste the thinking. Outside the small hearing room afterward, Thomas found her before Voss did, and said nothing at all for a long moment, only pulled her into an embrace that had clearly been rehearsed in his own head for the better part of 6 weeks, in case this exact outcome ever actually arrived. You're shaking, he said, finally, pulling back to look at her. I've been shaking since the moment I sent that first message, Wren admitted. I just didn't have anywhere to put it down until now. 6 months later, Wren stood on solid ground for the first time in over 3 years, on a shoal she had only ever seen from 300 kilometers up, feeling the strange, unfamiliar pull of real gravity beneath her boots. Sarelle met her at the edge of the rebuilt lock, moving slowly with the particular careful dignity of the very old, her granddaughter half hidden behind her the way children hide behind grandparents everywhere, curious and shy in equal measure. "You are the voice from the weather signal," Sarelle said, without preamble, in the formal cadence of the old touch language rendered now into careful spoken words, because contact protocols required plain honesty from the very first meeting, and Wren had insisted on it long before the committee had. "I am," Wren said. "I did not expect you to have a face," Sarelle said, and there was something almost like laughter under the words, worn thin by exhaustion but not gone. "I had imagined, when I imagined you at all, something closer to weather itself. A kindness with no shape." "I'm sorry it took so long to come with a shape attached," Wren said. "There was a great deal of paperwork in the way." "There is always a great deal of paperwork in the way," Sarelle said, with the weary understanding of someone who had spent a long life dealing with councils and guilds and militias of her own. "I have found, in my own small experience, that the paperwork rarely moves as quickly as the people it is meant to protect require it to. I am glad, all the same, that someone eventually decided the paperwork could wait." She looked past Wren, out toward the water, where the tide was coming in steadily, exactly on schedule, against a lock her own grandfather had built and abandoned and that she had rebuilt with her own 2 hands and one stranger's small, anonymous kindness. "My granddaughter would like to ask you something," Sarelle said, "if you would permit it." The child stepped forward, still half shy, and asked, in the careful, formal phrasing children use when they've rehearsed a question they consider very important, "Are there many of you? People in the sky, who leave kindness where it can be found?" Wren thought of Voss's quiet statement to the committee, filed without being asked. She thought of Thomas, waiting for her back at the shuttle, having volunteered for the ground team the moment it was authorized. She thought of Fenn's slow, careful ruling, and of 2 officers in 300 years who had staked everything on the belief that conscience should still count for something inside a system built to move slowly. "Not as many as there should be," Wren said honestly, "but more than you might think. And I have found, since I came to know your world, that it does not take very many of us to matter, if the ones who are there are willing to act." The child considered this with great seriousness, the way children consider the answers adults give them when they suspect, correctly, that the answer is more complicated than it sounds. "I hope you stay a long time," she said finally. "I intend to," Wren said, and found, as she said it, that it was entirely true. Ferried found her later that afternoon, down at the lock itself, where the broad-shouldered engineer was inspecting the counterweight gate with the same suspicious thoroughness she'd brought to it the very first day. She did not offer a greeting so much as a verdict. "It has held 11 storm tides now," Ferried said, without looking up from the mechanism. "I have inspected the gate after each one. The strain distributes exactly as the diagram promised. I no longer reserve my suspicion about the mathematics." She straightened, finally, and studied Wren with the same careful, assessing look she'd once given the anonymous drawing. "I still reserve some suspicion about the kindness, if I am honest. Kindness with a face and a name attached is a different thing to judge than kindness with none. I have not yet decided what I think of you, Dr. Okafor, beyond that your mathematics were correct." "That seems like a fair place to start," Wren said. "I'd rather earn the rest of it slowly than have it handed to me because of what I did once." Ferried almost smiled at that, a small, grudging thing, but real. "That," she said, "is the first sensible thing you've said since you arrived." Wren spent the rest of the afternoon walking the shoal with Doran as a guide, learning the names of things she'd only ever seen from orbit. The particular blue-green reed that grew along the tide flats and which Ilvain children learned to weave into rope before they learned much else, the low stone shrines at the edge of the water where old touch songs were still pressed into clay by hand, the smell of the sea at low tide, sharp and mineral and entirely unlike anything her instruments had ever managed to transmit. Doran, for his part, asked more questions than his 11 years of careful discipline under Sarelle's tutelage had ever quite allowed him to ask anyone, and Wren found she did not mind answering a single one of them. When the light began to fail, she walked back out to the edge of the lock alone, and stood where she had stood that morning, and looked up instead of down, at a sky that had spent 3 years being the only view she had of this world. Somewhere up there, invisible now behind the day's last light, Aegis 9 still turned in its slow orbit, and Thomas was very likely standing on its observation deck at this exact moment, looking down at the exact patch of shoreline where she now stood looking up. It occurred to her, standing there, that the story she might one day tell about all of this would probably need a better ending than the truth could offer. Something cleaner, something that resolved every thread the way a listener might want it resolved. The truth was messier than that. Ferid still withheld her full trust. The Threshold Committee's ruling had opened one door and left 100 others exactly as locked as they'd always been. Appeal 7C had taken 14 months to grant, and there would be other appeals, on other worlds, that might take just as long, or longer, with no guarantee that another Ren Okafor would happen to be listening when they did. But the tide had come in at Telling Shoal, on schedule, for the first time in 14 months, and a grandmother no longer had to lie to her granddaughter about whether kindness existed. That, at least, was not a story. It was simply true, and it would go on being true long after every committee ruling about it had been filed and forgotten. Behind her, the tide continued coming in, exactly as it should, on a shoal that had very nearly stopped believing it ever would again.